Okay, so it looks like recording's going. So yeah, so like pretty much,
Wait, can you post? Sorry, can you post the link for the meeting minutes?
yeah, so here. So we'll collect notes and links there.
Yeah, thanks.
And comments. So 1 second. Okay. Well, so I guess pretty much the main thing is, we kind of started jumping into it while we were in wait mode. But basically, it's really to go over kind of like the reports and then just kind of have like whatever kind of ongoing casual conversation about, STO stuff in general. So I guess would you guys like to just kind of jump in and kind of either, screen share and scroll to certain areas of the doc, and then we can just have a conversation? I mean, that might be easiest if there's certain things you want to cover. We
Sure,
don't have to go
yes.
through every detail of the doc, but, you kind of called out a couple specific areas.
Yes. So I can share some stuff. Wait 1 sec. Just need to find the right window. Yes. So let me go. Well, basically, obviously, since this report is not just for tech people and so on, and wasn't only, well, the contributions are from different areas, business expertise and so on. So basically, we obviously have the intro, and most of the things here are, well, not too interesting for us, but what is actually interesting is obviously what people are looking for. So what are the big hopes for any company and all these infrastructure builders to get out of the STO hype? And well, it looks like they're betting on some high potential return financing options, but at the same time, it's obviously also a little anticlimactic because you can expect a lot of new stuff just because you have more assets to invest in. Liquidity and so on will be major factors. But this is something that everybody can read through if they're interested in this. But what we really need to look at, well, in our opinion, is the edge case scenarios and basically what we want to cover. And I think that's also the main question for this working group. Like, what is the scope that we're trying to solve here with the first iteration of NEM standard? If I think that's the common goal here, right? And what is something that we do not and cannot solve immediately? We already received some feedback from, I think it was Gimri, that that already predefined that we cannot do everything that we maybe wanted to do, and that means the metadata conditions that are needed for some of this are apparently not going to be in the first metadata release, meaning that we cannot expect that functionality, and hence can do the more complex. Some of the other features that we are using based on the assumptions, or that we're using for the assumptions that are part of our NEM solutions, are also not fully defined yet. So there's quite some speculation going on, and how to solve stuff will actually depend on the final specifications for these features. But the main ideas are always very similar. The VTF, and I think we talked about this last time, outlines some primary examples for trading, and everybody is using similar tools. The difference between the approaches is more or less in what you actually try to solve on chain, what you're trying to solve off chain, and if you try to build some of the stuff on-chain yourself, for example, in smart contracts, or if you're trying to combine functionality. Obviously, our approach is to combine functionality and to do as little on-chain as possible to remain flexible, but you need to do some of the important stuff. So the most important thing to do on-chain is obviously the transaction verification, so that it only goes through if some conditions are met, and that's basically whitelisting. So with account filters, we can do quite a lot of stuff, but there are some additional requirements, and this is already going to be a question that can be answered in multiple ways. So shared KYC AML is obviously something that would be really cool, but we also heard from real world examples, it's highly unlikely that's possible. It may be possible for some instances, but like for the current setups, it's highly unlikely. Everybody and anybody is actually doing their own KYC, AML, and other checks when people are signing up for the exchanges. But sharing that would be possible based on metadata, but only if there's metadata conditions. So that's something that is definitely an interesting topic, but I think this is something where it would be interesting to hear other opinions. What we really need and what we really want to solve first here, because the standard default account filter feature is pretty much I think it's sufficient for a normal whitelisting solution, but metadata based conditions will be really interesting because they are needed for some more advanced solutions where you have whitelisting plus metadata conditions. So I think the best way to actually go through these sections is to actually try to discuss them maybe as we go through them. So for whitelisting, is there any strong preference what we should include in like a first in a first standard, or is this more or less, well, let's just go with the most simple function, which is the account filter? So maybe someone has an opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is Nate. My sense is, I think this level of, again, but the play between, and we'll probably revisit this a couple of times as we move through the various topic points, but the notion of kind of the metadata stuff providing like attribute pairs that can be reasoned off-chain is kind of the first iteration while we learn how the dev, sometimes I've used the term programmable mosaics, can be applied to actually take into account some of that data. And it's not going to be magical and like full feature. There's going to have to be some restrictions. And I think that will kind of apply. I mean, like one of the biggest things with whitelisting is just, it's from a performance perspective, like if you're in a super controlled environment, like private network, not a ton of people or a ton of assets, potentially. But when you start saying, well, this should also work on a public network with any number of assets and any number of users, that's where it kind of becomes problematic. So then you start to say kind of, well, what are the constraints where we can have like a small amount of data that kind of represents what should be a whitelist, and then something is reasoning about that, potentially off-chain and not verifying or not signing on a multisig. And there's always going to be trade-offs of well, if the more stuff that happens off chain, the more it's kind of not in a quote unquote decentralized full custodial level at the end user. But at the end of the day, for most of the assets, it's not going to be anyways, right? Any of these regulated assets are not for the users.
Does that mean that for the first iteration, you would say, it's fine to not have these conditions, and that we should try to revisit those when we have a better understanding also of self-regulated tokens and so on? Yeah. Or would you try to already include it? Because I think the devs are also not super sure what's the best way to handle it, right? And I mean, there have been discussions, but I haven't seen or read a conclusion like this is the way to go.
Yeah, it means essentially the only details have been discussed is kind of like, let's keep it simple and worry about scalability from both a data storage perspective and from a just raw kind of performance of kind of what kind of transactions would have to happen, right? So like again, from a whitelisting perspective, we've talked about a couple different ways of it over the last 6 months, based on the old docs and just general conversations online and on the phone, right? So like, one methodology is to say, we'll control a full whitelist of people that are, kind of past quote unquote KYC and AML and whatever authorizations, right? And then maintain that list. And then another way is, well, as people qualify, essentially, tag, right? So that's where we kind of reflected it back through the lens of metadata and saying, well, apply these tags on their accounts. You're not keeping some, kind of centralized list at like the asset level, right? Like you're not trying to keep this master list on the Mosaic side, maintain it there. It's kind of distributed across the accounts. And then how either off-chain or through some programmable Mosaic can we reflect that back through to allow or prevent some transfer based on a specific tag being there, right? Or set.
But the tagging is only useful if it can be used by multiple people. Like if it moves into the direction of sovereign identity and reusable claims, because otherwise the tagging is just more, actually more computation for the same result, right? If it just results in the same list, you can also just curate the list.
Yeah, but like, I mean, you understand there's a fundamental difference of like saying, like, let's say you have 100,000 token holders. Trying to maintain a centralized list of 100,000, like you can still do that versus this transaction's happening at this point in time and it's going to account XYZ. I'm going to check that account has one of these specific, one or more sets of tags. And the only way they can have those tags is they would have been applied by someone in my trust group, right? Whether it's the issuer or other, right? That is.
Yeah, it seems like you should use a lot less resource than trying to parse through a massive list.
So while solving the same problem, it's fundamentally different to reflect on the problem contextually that way versus saying, I'm maintaining a list of 100,000 and then I'm constantly like pushing and pulling from that list of 100,000 and updating it. And so
I'm actually not sure that computation it's different because if it's a NoSQL thing, but I agree that it's like the it feels a little more granular what you can do if it's Metadata based. But the question is really like, would you gain like for the first set of STOs that will be issued? Would you actually gain something from having a metadata based solution compared to an account filter solution? I mean, for example, Dave, what you're trying to issue, for example, do you think that it makes a difference?
Not specifically in the solo instance. I could see it where it might make a difference if you were trying to deal with different classes of share, perhaps, at the same time. But no, for solo, I think it would work either way.
I mean, Nate, do you have any examples where you believe it should be based on metadata today, or as soon as this is implemented? Because I mean, I honestly like it.
There's a couple of things that I do think would make it easier to be metadata based. Obviously, as you start to expand out to being authorized in different jurisdictions, account whitelisting then starts to get a bit harder because it's just a blanket whitelist.
But you're also referring to one person trading multiple assets and using the same claims, or
well, I suppose both. I was thinking originally per asset. So if I issue something that, I don't know, for the sake of argument, I decide that I can't issue to, I've forgotten the term, US investors that aren't sufficiently mature or advanced or whatever. Or you might only be allowed to purchase a minimum amount from certain jurisdictions. So I think where you tag an account for one asset, it would be useful to be approved in certain locations or not in others. But then also, obviously, as you mentioned at the start, if I have one account, actually it would be really useful to only have to have that one account authorized by somebody who is trusted by both parties who are issuing the assets, so that I don't have to get myself whitelisted on both of the assets whitelists.
Yeah. Well, I'm just not super sure, but I think that's also something for the developers to figure out if like how complex, because basically the complexity of conditions, or maybe it will be called programmable mosaics. Obviously, that complexity can rise a lot depending on what kind of conditions we allow. Like if it's just and conditions, or conditions, multiple signers, and so on. I mean, it could easily increase the complexity for transaction verification. So, I mean, if we want to propose something like this, we should probably define some sort of, maximum set of functionality or conditions that we imagine are needed for, well, to cover at least, 80% of the use cases. Because I think like if it's an and or plus multiple brackets for the condition, then that's definitely slower than going through or just matching if it's in an array of 100K addresses.
Well, like the one problem with that is, I mean, 100K is hypothetical, right?
Well,
Yeah, I think for me the challenge would be if you start having to bring in multiple whitelists, you still have the and or. It's just you've also got the search. So if you're trying to achieve the same thing and you can't achieve it with just one central list. So I don't know, say for the sake of argument, you want to know who is a sufficiently advanced investor and has cleared themselves for that, but has also passed KYC. You obviously, if you can't record it against the account directly, then you need either multiple facets to that list or multiple lists, in which case you get into the same problem, I think.
Yeah. So can we, I mean, is this something that we can define? Well, I don't know what kind of time frame we have until the next meeting, but that we try to define some sort of, superset of conditions that we want to allow, or that we believe are needed if we want to go for metadata conditions. I mean, it's probably not going to happen anytime soon, since metadata is not really defined yet fully, as far as I don't know, maybe Nate knows, but I think is it decided? Because I think that was like the first major decision before anything can happen, right?
Yeah, so I mean, put it this way, for general metadata, like it's not, definitely wouldn't say it's definitely not finalized, but the general concepts are kind of finalized, and that's kind of like filling in the last blanks. So we're kind of talking about kind of three different things here, right? We're talking about account filters and kind of permissions on accounts, right? Which is the features that were introduced back in Bison and are kind of now, evolving or whatever, right? Then we're talking about metadata, which is just name value pairs that can be applied in the current, where things are quote unquote finalized, where the current thinking is, metadata key value pairs can be applied by anyone to any account on a subset of objects, and they kind of have this behavior as far as asserting and expiring, or asserting and removing, which is kind of like the equivalent of a forced expire. And that's the level we've kind of, let's say, come to an agreement, like, hey, kind of what's there now. Things that we're still kind of out on metadata are, although I'm kind of heavily pushing towards this, is kind of audit history. So, one idea is, hey, all metadata should be there for all time. And then the inverse, and this is just literally a design discussion, is no, it shouldn't, just the latest version. If you want to maintain history, you maintain that in a secondary type of functionality that can be added as a plugin optionally or something, right? So we got like account filters in one feature, we got metadata in another feature, and then you got programmable mosaics that might, leverage and interact with metadata potentially, right? That's so I would say of those three feature sets, account filters and metadata are pretty much, account filters are pretty dialed in. Metadata from a design perspective is, whatever, let's say 80 to 90% dialed in, but some of the final holes that will be filled and decided on will make a difference. The one that has the biggest gap is programmable mosaics, because that's literally just been brought up as a concept of like, hey, take mosaics, let's throw the term programmable on it, and then allow you to make them a little bit more functional and smart. But there's been no specific design. That literally surfaced through some side conversations. And then it, again, when there were some forum posts and I kind of projected out saying, what are some people thinking from a roadmap perspective, from a branding, right? Some people like Jag replied and some other people. So I would say, like, in this particular topic, this notion of a programmable mosaic needs the most kind of discussion, design, and what are the constraints on the development side, whether they're super constrained, not possible at all based on how we envision it, to restrict so much that it becomes unfunctional, or hey, you know, we can get kind of part of the way there. So again, if that does that kind of help explain at least mentally how to frame it, where kind of have three features that, you know, at least metadata is kind of sitting in the middle and, you know, might play on both sides, but in particular with the programmable mosaic side, maybe based on how we might try to constrain it.
Yeah, I don't really like the name programmable mosaics, but I mean, it's metadata conditions or business rules for metadata. But yeah, I understand that that's like the most undefined area. But so does that mean that we should hold off on trying to come up with any kind of well, you know, scope of stuff that we would like to see in this? Because obviously it's not only for whitelist. Well, we've only hit the first one, but there are multiple scenarios, and also the VTF, it was pretty clear on you know, you need to have some conditions if you want to fulfill some of the more complex scenarios where you have you know, some accredited investors, but also transfers between exchanges and broker dealers, but, you know, no P2P transfer. For that, you definitely need it. So is this something that we should already start defining, or would you recommend holding off?
I think we should start defining, I mean,
defining is idea collection, basically, right? We're not really
I mean, start defining from, so based on what we know about metadata today, and start defining how, if we're, like, put it this way, at the highest level, the most minimal amount of conversations we had to date is, hey, maybe how can this concept of a programmable mosaic take certain types of input that will reflect back to data that's on chain that can be, you know, used for verification and allow or disallow, right, in the on-chain contract.
There is a kind of half step on that one, Nate, that we might be a version 1 option, that if rather than having the chain on the mosaic decide based on its own metadata or the account metadata or whitelist, etc., if you had it just call any kind of endpoint prior to allowing itself to be moved, then the endpoint could do the assessment of what's on chain. So rather than trying to boil the ocean by getting all of that in.
Yeah, but that just falls back into essentially off-chain, like multisig, right? That's what you would fall back on to allow or disallow, right? Functionally.
Yeah, I mean, you could just give it like a REST endpoint and say call this, and then the thing behind the REST endpoint looks up the chain and decides whether or not it meets the conditions required.
I mean, how would that be done in any sort of blockchain trust perspective?
You would run into some well, heavy performance issues, and you need to rely on it. Basically, you would block the transaction if the endpoint isn't available. But I don't know.
Yeah, but it would need to be if you didn't have it on chain.
Yeah, well, I mean, so that kind of feels more like, not say it can't be done, but
yeah,
at that level, if you're going to do that type of behavior, you might as well just throw all this in an off-chain multisig verifier, which again, realistically, I'm not going to say 100%, for the overwhelming majority of like regulated assets, they're going to be stuck in that world anyways, where it's not like your sole account that you control as an independent entity. You're going to be co-controlled with other signers and people that control it, right? It's just the nature of it.
Yeah.
So
while you were talking there, it kind of, sorry, it came out wrong, but I guess if you had an aggregate transaction that required a mandatory signature for a given asset type, then anybody who wants to create that functionality, so if we can't get in for version 1, if they need to sign the aggregate transaction, the issuer needs to sign the aggregate transaction, or the exchange or whoever is trusted to sign it. they can at least assess the information that is on chain and decide whether or not to sign it or leave it.
Or you omit it, right? So that's, again, it's in some ways it's kind of the same thing, but it's like you don't have to do anything other than all these accounts by default become some form of a multisig account.
Pretty much, yeah.
There's human and programmatic signers that allow or disallow, right? That's the kind of like off-chain model that leverages stuff on-chain.
Yeah, like it's not a great solution, but if we can't get the other one in for version 1, it's not an awful solution. I could see additional STOs use it.
The solution the most, actually. For Nate, it's the best solution there is. Multisig all the way.
Yeah, I mean, like so some of this, I mean, we remember we had kind of bantered about this like a long time ago, Paul, but I think in like text form and stuff on one of the old docs, but like, so I, not exclusively, but I kind of come at this through a couple different lenses. One is just general interest in the asset space. Two is working for a decent amount of time, like around ICOs and building some platform stuff around ICOs and KYC and AML stuff. Third, most recently back in last summer and fall, extreme, like in-depth design around private equity. And so some of these things, no matter how advanced you make this, it's gonna have to be multi-sig. And you're gonna have to have third-party approvers to allow to do it. Like literally there's certain asset classes, especially private equity, there's no way around it. Like, and then there's even tech, that's some of the stuff I was referring to earlier, Paul. Like if for private equity, there's certain stuff for certain asset classes that like, you can't do even the tech we have, right? There's a certain level of privacy and zero knowledge stuff that just does not exist today, not just in NEM, but in the general like cryptographic like research space, right? So that's stuff that we kind of have to wait to kind of emerge, and it probably will in the next year plus. But so yeah,
once you start getting into things like shifting properties around that requires a government intervention to say it's been done okay, like it's really hard to see how that doesn't become multi-sig in some way.
Yeah, so I think that's where I think like at a minimum, when we talk about like a phased approach, I think at a minimum, it's kind of like that's like our foundation, right? I think that's going to be our baseline regardless. To say, hey, you know, for these types of asset classes, if you have to do X, Y, and Z, like you're going to do it in this way. And by the way, it's there in multi-sig, super powerful, and we got aggregates and we got all this other stuff, right? And at the same time, in parallel, we constantly are trying to, like in a same manner, like push the limits. Let's say metadata to even the best terminology, metadata plus programmable mosaics. Like, can we push that to a level where maybe not, well, let's say definitely not in 100% of the scenarios, but in 20%, 40%, 60% of the scenarios, you can actually create on-chain functional behavior that can be driven leveraging metadata plus account filters with some quote-unquote programmable mosaic or, you know, extra functionality, right? Like, so I think it's kind of, we're doing kind of both these in parallel. We say like, well, with account filters and metadata, you know, these kind of multi-sig plus aggregate stuff can kind of just start to take form and prototype, right? So like with the VTS stuff, that was the lens we looked at it through. Hey, these guys would like to see some solution in 2019, preferably in the first, you know, half to 3/4 of the year. We got a bunch of unknowns, but we look at it through the lens of multi-sig and off-chain stuff. It's approachable in our world, right? And then from there, we just kind of continue to design out metadata, design out, you know, future Mosaic functionality. So I think that
it makes sense. It's hard to think of a use case that couldn't fall back to multi-sig aggregates.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's,
so if you use that as the base foundation to catch everything else that we can't do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, like, that's like a foundation and like an escape hatch. And then wherever we can get to with, hey, I'm going to tell my Mosaic that like, if this metadata doesn't exist, like don't allow the transaction, right? Again, just at like a high level logic level, let's say, you know, you program your Mosaic to say, if, you know, one of these 3 approved KYC metadata tags doesn't exist on the account that's trying to send or receive, like just invalidate the transaction, right? From a quote unquote programmable perspective, right? So like if that can be supported at some point, great. That would be super awesome and powerful for a bunch of use cases where you can just build some little UIs, do all that stuff on chain, and it's, you know, it solves some problems. For anything that's highly regulated, definitely for private equity, that stuff will maybe augment, but also that's going to be multiple control points and signers anyways.
Julian just actually told me that we should maybe look at the restrictions that we have, and basically there could be some input for the idea collection, because, well, if we try to enable these you know, business rules or conditions, or, well, we probably need some word that we all agree on. It either has to like fulfill the majority of it, or it's kind of useless. So stuff like min max and so on is also interesting, because, well, most of these will have most of the STOs will have some min or max for investors. And, well, if you already start tagging stuff, you know, you kind of either solve that through a centralized application, or you really try to solve it in the transaction. But yeah, basically it will be this kind of idea collection, plus obviously where we draw the line, and sorry, where it just makes sense to use multisig. So, but still going back to the question, should we already you know, collect these ideas? I mean, collecting them doesn't hurt, but I assume that we're first waiting on the final definition of you know, what will be possible up until programmable mosaics become a discussion point.
Yeah, so I think it does make sense, right? So I think it makes sense to continue to collect and refine these ideas as far as features, right? So for instance, like I see min-max investments, I guess that could mean a couple things, but so like one example might be for this asset class, which is you know, a mosaic on chain, there can't be more than 1,000 holders until something's changed, right? Based on some restriction.
Yeah, X number for accredited investors, for example, is one that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff, right? So like, for instance, private equity, different classes have its own limits. If you were to tokenize a startup project after a certain number of shareholders, which I believe is 1,000 or some number like that, you have to essentially, even if you're not a publicly traded company in the US, you have to act like a publicly traded company.
Yeah, it's pretty much a crowdfund limit, so you need to produce a prospectus and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So like, I think those things, like I think collecting these and saying, hey, and kind of like, well, you know, mosaics today, you can give, you know, is it mutable or not? What's the quantity? How divisible is it? And then we can kind of, if you think of it, again, I'm almost mentally on the fly just thinking of like what the UI would look like in an app. It's kind of like, well, that's like the simple form, and then you could say, oh, I want to go like advanced, right? And the advanced form says, oh, by the way, you can, you know, control, you know, min-max number of holders. You can control other things like, you know, allow transfer if these tags exist or whatever.
I mean, you know, one of the issues I think, and that's also one of the things that I'm, well, you know, a little afraid of, is we are increasing the complexity of NEM. Like it's not even comparable as magnitudes with the new features that are being introduced, and it will be extremely tough to get it right if we allow all of this on a mosaic level. Like basically, one issue, for example, let's say you have the min max. I think that's a good example. So you have the min max and you want to set it. Now, if you actually use metadata conditions to say, you know, you're KYC ML and you have the accredited investor tag from one of these signers, you know, you actually also need to have the min max as part of the condition. Otherwise, it won't work, because then someone could actually fulfill all the other metadata stuff, but it's still not allowed because the max has been hit. So like you cannot just focus on a subset of these requirements if you really want to go with a more complex examples of requirement chaining. And I think that actually increases the complexity of this a lot, because you're entering Ethereum territory where it will be tough to actually test everything. just because you have so many variations of combinations that you can set.
In fact, that's basically in point 3 of go-to-market in NEM solution. Because I've also seen in so many, no, you're already there. Don't scroll. I've seen so many solutions, and the most important is just like jurisdiction and investor status. And then I've seen, for example, also a compliance protocol where you can select another 10, 12 other restrictions. But most often it would make sense to just blanket those or say it does not apply. But if you want to actually include all of them, it's getting incredibly complicated, and you got to run so many checks.
Yeah, again, like I don't think we're talking about in one piece of functionality solving all things for all asset classes for everything in the world for all time, right? We're not talking about that. It's kind of like saying, you know what? The new super advanced multi-level multisig, guess what? That doesn't solve like every single multi-approval signing process for every solution in the world. Now, is it more advanced than the previous one? Yes. Can you do a ton more type of functionality? Yes. But it doesn't solve anything, right? So I think it's the exact same thing where we're not saying like, let's solve everything. It's like, how far can we push it in a sane manner, right? So to your point,
how far can we push it, Nate?
Like, right now, like mosaics are smart enough to know that you could put, it can be mutable or immutable. You can increase supply maybe if it's mutable. If it's not, you have a certain supply, and if someone tries to transfer a value, it has to make sure that there's, it doesn't, surpass it, right? So adding another check to say, oh, by the way, don't surpass the limit on what's trying to be transferred, but also make sure that this account that you're sending to is either the existing one or it's not changing the list over the limit, right? Like these things all add computation. The question then becomes like how restrictive do they have to be, right, to perform in like an average case, right? So I think that's where I think for some of these, we don't worry so much about performance, like compute performance. I think the first lens of performance is kind of probably storage. The second one is compute, but then compute is relevant to the network that these features are running on. So someone that says, hey, I would love to be able to run a network in a private manner that's X size, distributed around the world, that maintains 1,500 transactions a second, like without missing a beat. Guess what? If you want to do that, you can't run certain features or plugins. It's just the nature of it, right? Whereas on a public network like future NEM, NEM v2, NEM v2 is not going to support 3,000 transactions a second, regardless of what features we add beyond today, right? It's just the nature of it. So I think some of these things, I don't think we should like kind of overanalyze from like. Now, I also don't think we should throw the kitchen sink and say, let's solve these 82 problems. But I think we should say, it'd be nice if we could solve X, Y, and Z, and then reflect that in like functional behavior, and then have the devs do like a sanity check to say, well, here's the constraints at the storage level, and then here's the constraints or non-possibility at the compute level, right? Either from a performance or just from like a security perspective. There might be certain things that like, open up to certain issues, right? So anyways, that's my mindset, how I kind of like think about these things currently. Does that or make sense at all?
I believe very much, because like there's like 4 or 5 different conditions that make very much sense for this use case, from like jurisdiction, investor status, max investment, or like lockup periods. Why could you imagine that they also make sense for other use cases? But then again, if you want to send up all transactions, anyways have to be checked somehow off chain or by some kind of KYC provider or somewhat like that, because they just can't go through. And when you know that not everything can go through anyways, even like those almost self-regulated tokens, you don't need to actually solve everything. So I feel like identifying those 4 or 5 extra conditions could be really nice to get closest to a self-regulated token, but then just don't over-engineer it for now.
Yeah. I mean, like for instance, like lockup period, if you were just to assume that like things are happening in an aggregate, It's just kind of like, okay, well, you know, you're doing one or more transactions or a group of them in some aggregate that the issuer's proving, verifying, and then maybe in a separate one says, oh, by the way, I'm going to send these to you, you know, but it's also going to be like, you know, time locked for X amount of time or something, right?
Exactly. If you do an outside deal, you can still send it to somebody. And when you like integrate this as well, then it's going to be too complicated, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't involve anything that involves time is really a difficult issue to solve, because we don't really have real time, right? We only have block time, and basically I think all of this should be handled by external logic anyways. If there's like a specific time lock, and that also means that there's probably someone who is actually responsible for that, like a custodian or something. Like it really doesn't make sense to try to bring that into a native functionality.
Well, but but like where it does, again, like this is more app UX level. So again, it's not required, but one thing you could say is there's a metadata tag on the asset that is lockup period. And that time is, you know, 1 year.
Yeah, but sure, it's 1 year, but then 1 year is defined in block time, right? So you still don't have accuracy.
Yeah, I guess if you had a metadata tag of saying this is locked up or it's not.
You have it within a realistic period though, Paul. So like if you know what block time is based on the network time, like whatever.
Yeah, but is that going to hold up in like a legal? I actually saw one agreement. I forgot what it was, but it was actually, I think it was somehow asset related, and basically it said that it would like the lockup period or some sort of period would end the block after that timestamp. But you know, that knowledge is not something that we can guarantee based on the current NEM solution.
But we could actually just ignore time altogether, guys. So for version 1, if you just set a flag that was true or false and said locked up, when it unlocks, you just unset it, right?
That's the pragmatic solution, you know, just have the freeze functionality, freeze it, and basically unfreeze it when you want to unlock it. But that's going to be an issue, or well, someone definitely is going to do that actively, because I think like the more, you know, independent solution, even though it's nice, like it adds so much troubles that are basically, I think, not worth trying to solve right now.
Well, yeah. So there could be some caveats, right? Like I don't think there's a scenario where you can't use block time, right? If you assume that the network's under a certain level of control, and blocks are 1 minute or 15 seconds or whatever, right? You can project out in the future plus X blocks, right? I'm just saying from like the stuff you don't have to implement the functionality on chain, but you can apply the metadata to the asset so that it can be verified by third-party applications and services, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying like for there are some legal conditions that have to be really like where it's not just, you know, it's plus minus a few seconds. Like if some regulated stuff is really traded under conditions, you know, where you have, for example, the end of the year and the end of the trading year and that kind of stuff, you can't just say, you know, well, unfortunately it's spilled over into the next year. Sorry about that.
So there's tax implications of, I don't know, getting 15 or 30 seconds the wrong side of midnight, for example. If you're trying to avoid tax on equities.
So even though I think there's probably a need for you know, or there could be a need for that kind of stuff, I think it's unlikely that for what we're talking about right now, for the security tokens and regulated assets, it's probably unlikely that we're going to have that functionality built in the sense that it automatically triggers stuff.
Well, no, that's my whole point. None of this stuff is automatically triggered. That's why right. So in an application, how you would build this is your app would apply a metadata tag to your Mosaic that said the lockup period is 1 year. And then the app would say, hey, when I go to do a transfer, like let's say there's two different apps. One app is I'm using some portal app to create my, and I'm like the owner of it. And then there's an issuer or a transfer or an exchange or whatever. And that app says, well, the way I've written, I'm going to look at the definition of the asset on chain. I'm going to look for a lockup period data tag, take the value from that, generate a time lock transaction in an aggregate that's signed when I send this thing to someone, and then do that, right? So it's happening off chain. My whole point is,
okay, then that actually I get it.
done
I
on
thought
chain so
you
it can
meant
verify
automatic.
it, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the fundamental difference between storing some of the source of truth data on chain in like a metadata
yeah.
versus saying, hey, Sally, make sure to transfer this to someone, make sure to do it for 1 year or do it for this period, right? And just manually enter it. Where if you build it into the app can verify the data on chain. And so that if there is conflict or question at some period, you can actually reflect back in time and say, well, the app was written in this way, it's pulled the data from the chain, and therefore, just it's like, that's my point, is like the stuff happen off chain if someone wants to make it happen, and things like metadata can be leveraged for inputs into the it could be a
No, I think actually that is one of the better use cases for metadata, that you use it as input for application logic, and I totally agree with that point. So I think there was a little misunderstanding, but basically I think we all have this same shared understanding that it doesn't make sense to trigger stuff automatically based on these for lockup periods and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, I think we also have the same shared understanding that it probably doesn't make sense to try to figure out or implement these native requirements, like the restrictions in the first solution, because it's just, it adds a lot of complexity that's probably not worth implementing at this point in time, even though it's nice to identify the restrictions and actually try to come as close to the ability to build self-regulated tokens. I mean, everybody is dreaming about those, but probably the market for them is not going to be as big as the market for traditional assets in the beginning. But we could still try to aim to be as ready as possible for whenever that's going to happen. So maybe let's go back a little, back up. Well, so issuance is obviously an interesting one, and I think the main question here is, and there was also part of the the other doc, and I saw Dave made some comments. Well, one big question is the delegation of powers and who is actually doing issuance, and who has the rights to issue, and can multiple people have certain rights or powers for different parts of the issuance process and accreditation of users and that kind of stuff. So obviously we can go really complex, where we have a root account, or basically the root user, which is the company that wants to issue, that then delegates rights away to different performers of certain actions, like the broker dealers and so on and so on. But is that really something that we actually need as a first solution? Because it increases complexity a lot, and it also basically, I think it's something like multi-level multisig, where you really need to consider the depth of how deep can you go, like how many levels deep can you go with this kind of delegation, and how much is it actually adding to the general solution? Because the way I see it, most of the these issues, most of the issuances will just be done by walled garden solutions, where you just go to, for example, GSX, and they do everything for you. So delegating stuff away is probably not as interesting as it first appears, but maybe there's some good cases for why we should really focus on delegation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, to your point, there's a healthy balance again, where I think if you look at, kind of the access control and account filter functionality, that now granted, this is another case where you might hit some edge cases, but just based on like current constraints on accounts and multisig and stuff, I think in most cases you won't hit it, right? Where you could say, well, instead of looking at full super advanced cross account, like you could say, well, I'm going to have a multisig account set up in such a way that you do have this subring of signers for the different issuers. And
so you could have, like, I don't know, 3 KYC signers, and you one of 3 from that group, and then you have, I don't know, jurisdiction guys, and you need 1 or 3 from that group. And
Yeah,
tie
it's
that
like,
up in
of
an
course,
aggregate, you mean?
there's going to be constraints, of course, but you kind of stay in the first assumption. Well, if you're going to try to delegate to, 4,000 different people to like be able to sign this, and it's like, it's probably not the right way. But if you say, there's a couple key orgs, and in those orgs, there's a couple key people, then, it kind of works in the constraints of everyone being able to kind of exist under this kind of single issuer account. Or it's, again, you could do another scenario where you have kind of like multiple accounts. Again, there's degrees of how the user experience can be driven to say, well, there's the issuer account that created it, and then whether it's in blocks or the whole lot, you transfer that to a second account, which is kind of the co-owned and co-managed account that you can pull people on and off of depending on authorizations and whatnot, right? I think that's very approachable based on kind of where we're at today, and then kind of what will kind of be coming in the next few months. Some of that, literally what we have today, can kind of start to solve that, right? Building the UXs on top of the features that are there.
Yeah, so I think as a bare minimum, that's a reasonable approach. It's not probably the nicest experience generally for what we're trying to achieve. So I would think being able to have delegate transactions, for example, rather than having to set up a complicated multi-sig arrangement which you then have to manage.
Yeah, but again, like this is where I'll go back to like user experience in the application. At the end of the day, you can build a UX where it would be imperceivable to the end users.
Yeah, but the company that's issuing the token could find it a real pain in the ass.
Is what?
So the UX would work, but just to keep managing, and in your example where you got, say, 4,000, trying to manage that would be a nightmare.
Oh, you mean versus delegating to another account?
Yeah.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the solution would have to manage that account anyways, right? So I'll give you 2 scenarios. We'll use smaller numbers, right? So let's say there's 10 users, not 4,000, but just for logic's sake, right? And so these 10 users all are authorized, right? So I put them as an aggregated, kind of group of signers as a one level down, right, in the multi-level. So if they're all under the same account, you're going to kind of have to have, let's say, 2 UXs, right? So one UX is me as the creator is going to allow you, the issuer. I'm going to like add you as an authorized issuer to my asset, and there's some process in that, right? So the app can do that in one step. Now, whether that's literally linking in your account as a signer or whatever, right? It does what it does. Then in your account, there has to be a UX that says, okay, Dave has 10 signers, but then he needs to add an 11th. Then he needs to add a 12th. Then he needs to add a 40th. Now he needs to, one guy left, so he needs to remove it. Now he's at 39, right? So those 2 UXs have to exist independently, regardless of whether this is all on the same account or.
Yeah, that's fair. Yep.
Right. That's my point is like a lot of these things, not all of them, but a very high percentage of them. When you start just putting like the actual user experience in front of it, a lot of stuff can be hidden under the covers where a user is just like clicking on a group, right? Like, hey, I'm not managing this like spreadsheet of like 10,000 keys. I'm just clicking on an org. And then behind the scene, the app is doing a bunch of transactions to like, aggregate or something that have to like add and remove, 1 or more teams or something, right? Again, there will be probably some breaking points, but if you were to snap your fingers and say the magical UX is there, some of the stuff can be pushed under the covers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So would you say that then, the delegation of powers is not something that's super interesting, because it's mostly interesting for issuance and obviously for onboarding any kind of user, a number of users. Because, for anything else, you basically, you obviously have the day-to-day management of some of the lists, but as you just mentioned, there are some ways to, it's probably not as interesting to delegate all of this away in the pure delegation sense, but there's some other solutions to solve it. So maybe you have some insights into also what the developers think about this kind of delegation and if it's really needed. Possible at all, you know.
It's one of those things that was kind of talked about when it was being first introduced, right? So I think the first introduction of it was for the actually the editing of multisig, right? I think that was literally the root, like account filter, access control thing. That was kind of like, hey, let's get this in to control the kind of spam scenario where someone just starts to add a bunch of accounts to a bunch of multisigs and kind of blocks them out. And so it's interesting obviously from that perspective and a handful of others. Now being this super duper delegate anything to anyone, it's again, like most of the logic ends up saying, well, it's great to be more powerful, but at the same time, reason about kind of performance and storage, right? Compute performance and storage performance of like what needs to actually be done. So I think definitely, the next enhancements to account filters make sense. But just there's the cleanup, and I can't remember some of the other features that were done. They changed some stuff on the storage side. This was a while back, but they haven't like expressed any things around like cross account. Again, it was conversated about when we were drafting the old docs and stuff, but not to the sense of like how far can we push it. So again, I'd say like most of the time it's like I would say the cross account stuff would be like a nice to have, kind of like let's say programmable mosaics. Nice to have. If we can get to some level of it, given a certain amount of constraints, then yeah, it can make sense. The rest of it, let's just kind of use the tools that we have today to build on top.
I think the case, at least I can't think through my head how you would do it with multisig, is where you wanted to delegate the ability to manage metadata at an account level.
Well, so for that, in theory, so if you think of all these things as actions, so you would maybe say, I have, a filter. I have a thing that says the action of create metadata tag or send metadata tag has these constraints on it, right? And you basically could constrain it to certain signers or whatever, right?
Okay.
If you think of it just like a raw, like let's remove blockchain for this is just like a normal enterprise app. We're talking about access control. The action is I'm going to prevent Sally from running the create metadata tag, right? So if anytime she tries to like do it, the system's going to be like, sorry, you don't have the role to perform that action. And so I think that level is kind of like, again, to try to simplify it in a generic non-blockchain form. Everything you're doing is essentially invoking some action on the system.
Yeah. So that I think that approach, it works at a technical level, but I think it leaves you open to somebody like Ponte deciding to initiate a whole bunch of transactions, even though he knows he can't sign them, and then you've just got Is that Paul's screen or is that the call? Oh no, it's okay. It looks like Paul's dropped off.
Oh.
Yeah, so if you decided to try and spam the network, that would actually be a really good way of doing it, because you'd just create a whole bunch of transactions that would never get signed off, but we're just sitting annoyingly in the way.
Yeah, but you'll be able to do that anyways, right? Like yeah, the notion of like this stuff's like exclusive of like the spam concept, right? So there's general spam, like I'm going to run a bunch of GET requests, right? I'm going to write some bots to just like pull the shit out of all the API nodes and try to just bring down the network that way. That's one form of spam. One of them is, hey, there's this cool feature called metadata. I'm going to spend a bunch of money to just spam the shit and just tag the hell out of a ton of accounts, right? Which is kind of the new style form of kind of what's done today at the Mosaic level, right? So like regardless of what you do, you're kind of never going to get around that except from the lens of spam prevention, right? So, hey, this account is doing these levels of transactions. The network should kind of do that. Hey, this guy's doing a million GET requests, a minute. We should probably start to block the inbound IP from that and not even let the transaction go through or something, right? So,
yeah, but in this instance, if you have somebody, if you're trying to use if you're trying to enforce access control through multisig, you end up with the transaction being created and effectively timing out because there's nothing to say that you shouldn't create that transaction. So you just start blowing out the numbers of transactions that are sitting there waiting to be dealt with. Whereas if you have the delegate, then it can be blocked at the point of trying to create the transaction to say you're not allowed to. So that one just doesn't sit in the queue. So it seems like it leaves a.
Yeah, again, I think in most scenarios, like no matter what you do, you're going to have like a pool of transactions that are in an intermediate state. So let's just say, I'll give you two scenarios. Someone sends 100,000 spam transactions to what you just described. And at the exact same time, within the same minutes, there's another 100,000 transactions that are valid multisigs that are waiting to be signed off on. Like what's the difference between those two, right? Like one of them is a big, huge pool of valid transactions that are waiting to be signed off on, and like everyone's at lunch, so they can't sign them, right? So they're just going to sit there until they expire, until they get signed off on. So at some level, it's definitely an issue in the fact that yes, it could happen, but through the lens of like it's a hole in like spam protection. Like again, take account filters out of it. I'm just going to spin up a ton of multisig accounts and just blast a bunch of temporary transactions constantly all day long and just try to fill up the temporary transaction pool across the network. Like regardless of what happens on the account filter access control.
Oh yeah, there's loads of other vectors. It just this seems like a new one.
Yeah.
Opened up with the difference between multisig and delegate.
It's definitely like yet another one of like a partial transaction that has to be handled at the API node level across the network, right?
Yeah.
Definitely.
But again, I think we end up in the same position where multisig is a good enough fallback, but there's a better way of doing it. And if we have the time to do it, it'd be better to do it that way.
Yeah. So actually, let me just go ahead and continue talking. I'll make some notes in the background.
Okay. I think Paul's come back on as well.
Yes,
see your screen again,
I had some Wi-Fi troubles, but I think so. What I called was basically the ability to define user groups again in a normal role-based access system compared to delegation can be a little simpler. Is that what Nate was suggesting? Basically, like defining
the suggestion was
group.
basically that everything we described, you could achieve with multisig, but if we had the delegate capability, that it would be probably more
so what about your
elegant.
example? What about your example with the what is it, metadata?
Yeah, so if you required it to be an aggregate transaction that the issuer signed off on, whether that's automatic or not, then you can control it that way.
But for metadata,
or preventing, or just looking at it through the lens of you're not doing a cross-account delegation, but within a multisig account, you can use the account filters to prevent certain actions on the account, right?
Or enable them
sure,
by effectively delegating by sticking them into a multisig group.
Yeah, but so basically, if you use a multisig for that, that means you give the multisig all powers, right? You cannot limit the powers that you want to delegate through multisig to just a certain multisig group, right? All of these groups can the group can then do all actions on the account, meaning that it can also change everything for the Mosaic.
Good job.
It'd be more. It's the more granular level, right? So you're getting down to the action level, right? So you're saying, let's just say there's the five of us are signers on an account. I say,
we're only four. We lost someone.
Each fan had to go.
Yeah. So so we're all signers on an account, and instead of saying, "Hey, this other account, I'm gonna put certain allow certain things," right? Because you look at access control, right? It's either typically allow or disallow, right? So allow this other account to do stuff on my account, and I will make it so. Another way to I can't tell you how much it might simplify or whatever. Another way to say is, on this account itself, whoever has access to this account, I'm going to allow or disallow certain actions. Right? So that's a level of kind of like access control within an account. So
yes, so I think to Paul's point, though, effectively the fallback model here gives everybody full admin on everything.
Yeah, it's not as granular, right? So if all of us are the co-sigs, that means all of us can do all actions on the account.
Yeah, I mean, like we could all issue a lock transaction, right?
Yeah.
Or a freeze or an unfreeze, for example, when perhaps we shouldn't be able to.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So my whole point is, if you look at it in tiers, like one tier is, hey, account filters exist, and everyone on that account can do all things to the account. Then in my mind, we're kind of leaping ahead a step to say, let's have a bunch of delegation and access control to other accounts. Like in my mind, potentially an intermediate step is, let's just make it a little bit smarter within the same account based on whatever constraints we would have to impose. Right?
But how does that work? So if you say within the account, that means that anybody who has access to the account can do all the same actions, so that you would actually assign, like make the access control on the co-sigs, basically defining what a co-sig can do, or how do you imagine that working?
Yeah, it would have to be at like a co-sig key level, right? And then we'd obviously there's certain constraints that would have to exist based on the size and number of signers and actions and shit.
Okay, I mean it's pretty similar, right? It's just a different way.
It doesn't sound hugely different to me whether you do that in account or at a co-sig level. Like complexity-wise, it sounds about the same. So I don't know. Say for example, in the instance where one of the four of us is an approved KYC provider, and that's all they're approved for, but the other three are, I don't know, fully trusted issuing platforms. You wouldn't want that KYC guy to be able to issue a transaction that said freeze or unfreeze or change the metadata, except in relation to KYC stuff. So you would need to somehow be able to say that this group of co-sigs over here can do everything, and this group of co-sigs over here can only change KYC stuff.
Yeah, that goes to allow or deny. Right? It's like standard. Again, I kind of look at this through the lens of a standard enterprise product, right? With like role-based access control.
Yeah, I just can't think in practice how you actually do it.
Yeah, because like it's always the lens through allow or deny, right? So I can, just like whitelisting, I'm blacklisting, right? It's kind of the same thing. It's kind of like, well, blacklist this person or this group or whatever, and they can't do anything until I grant them capabilities to do stuff. Or, hey, this is a super admin or a super user, allow them to do everything until I blacklist them to not be able to do certain things.
But I mean, the issue, well, what you mentioned, or what maybe that's also misunderstanding, but what we mentioned before, if you do that kind of stuff on the co-sig, then I think it's one level too low, because that means you basically work with the same group all the time, because let's say it's the four of us. So the four of us are the ones that are controlling the issuer account. So now we want to delegate to just Dave and Julian the ability to do some whitelisting. So change account filters. So that effectively means that we already have two different kind of groups, co-sig groups, that work independently. Not talking about the rights, because obviously then you also only assign the rights to one group and not the other. Wouldn't it be much simpler to just tell in the account, well, these are the kind of account actions that you can do, and these are the people that I'm allowing in these actions? Because the co-sig solution basically ignores the fact that it may be different kind of signing setups, like instead of a field of 4, which would include all of us for issue action, we only need account filters. So you're talking about
it's kind of the difference between delegating to individual or delegating to group, and really an enterprise app level, it's the same thing pretty much.
But from the setup and maintenance, basically setting up the groups on the account, just doesn't it make it? I think it makes a lot more sense. But maybe I don't know. Maybe it doesn't.
No, I agree. It seems simpler to me. to do it at the individual level.
Or,
But otherwise, you would potentially need
the person level.
Sorry, Matt.
The individual or the person level, right? You're talking about the account level?
yeah, at account level.
Because there's a notion of an account can be a person and an account can be a whole team of people, right?
Yeah, sure, but
Yeah,
basically,
sorry, I meant account level, not rather than COSIG, which is effectively a group of accounts.
for the account that you're trying to well, basically restrict some stuff or allow some stuff, for that you would do directly at the account level, then you have the max amount of flexibility, right?
Yeah.
And I think probably it's easier in terms of admin, even if it's hidden by UX.
Well, it's all the same, right? At the end of the day, it's just the extra constraint of whether or not that person's part of the top.
No, it's all the additional COSIG groups you need to create. So if you want to model out something that starts to get a bit more complicated, you could easily end up with 2 or 3 different COSIG groups.
Dave, you'd have to have that anyway.
Why?
Whether or not that accounts, the exact same thing as what we talked about earlier, where when I was using the 4,000, then we dumped it down, or 100, right, and then dumped down 10. Like at the end of the day, let's say I'm writing an action to say allow action foo to account 1, 2, 3. Now, whether that account, like the difference we're talking about here is, in one scenario, I'm saying that these rules are going to be enforced for things that are currently under this multisig account versus things that exist anywhere on the blockchain. And I can't tell you like if one is more constrictive or harder to implement from a scaling perspective than the other. That's up to the devs. I'm just bringing up the point that one lens to look at it through is you could take an account key, put a restriction on the action that can be performed under this account. Then the added thing is whether or not it's a cosigner on this account. So I don't know from a scalability perspective if it allows a certain level of introspection, right? I don't know if you guys,
Yeah, okay. So yeah, you've gone slightly further or half a step beyond where I was.
Right. So like all we're doing is concerning.
So
we're just constraining kind of, I don't want to say constraining the search space, but at one level, you're just almost creating this like initial like search verification space that says.
No, but your example assumes the use of COSIG. So
yeah, it's like hey, if
you're not using multisig
account, I can just throw it away. I don't even have to worry about it, right? It's like that would almost be like the first gate. And then the second gate is, hey, they are a signer on this account. Now I can get into the levels of whether or not they have the ability to do this action, right?
Yeah, but what it means that the app behind the scenes needs to do is to create multisig accounts for all of those roles, even if there's only one user in that multisig group. Whereas if you stick,
it would be however it is. It's just an address, right? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, but that isn't I still think that there's some flaw in this, because if you look at it from a perspective of well, it's different. Like if the approval process is not the same for all actions, right? So if we have 4 COSIGs and you want to go into granular settings of who is allowed to do what, the M of n is not the same for the different actions. And right now, as multisig, well, the way multisig is defined, obviously you can have multi-level multisig, but that doesn't solve the problem, because you will run out of options. Like I don't think it's possible to basically solve everything through these kind of COSIG combinations.
Oh no, it can be solved, and I'm not saying there's not constraints. I'm just saying this is a possibility, right? So I get that there's a limit of the number of signers, and then within those signers can be co-signers themselves, which can have another limit, and that's where the multi-level stuff comes in. Like I'm just bringing up the point of, from a functional perspective, you can have cross account, like these 2 accounts have nothing to do with each other, and you can delegate and allow or deny like action, right? Well, everything is inherently denied, and then you would basically be allowing. And if we're starting to talk about like issue, kind of transfer relationship, we started this conversation talking about how advanced do we need to make cross account delegation. And I was just bringing up the point of how about in-account delegation, where you are constraining of what people can do or not do, right? Like here's a perfect example. let's not even talk about like STO stuff. Like I just have an asset and I have like a financial planner who has like power of attorney to like do stuff for me and like my wife. And so like in that scenario, I might want to grant some stuff to him on this account. Now, whether or not he actually lives on that Multisig account or it's a separate account kind of don't matter, except that the implementation would behave a little bit different, right?
Yeah, it's just I can see scenarios where if you start to get slightly more complex than that, you end up having to create multiple COSIG groups that you wouldn't have to if it was on the account level. So in the instance of that guy, for example, if he's allowed to act in his own capacity without actually having to be a co-signer on a multi-sig account, because he's just an account that's allowed to do stuff with your asset, there's no reason to go and create all those multi-sig groups.
But I wouldn't be. I would be creating an action. So whether or not he exists as a multi-sig, like do you understand? At the end of the day, you are affecting some state change to the system. So you're either, I mean, it's kind of hard to explain it without like maybe.
I mean, you're signing for something else for sure. I mean, I get that point. I think that's, but the issue that I see is, let's not call it then that you're using multisig for that, but basically you're signing on behalf of another account, like for these actions, right? So the problem that I see is that if you sign for another account on behalf of certain actions, basically you need complete independence, and that can break some, or it can actually solve some, no, not solve, create some complexity that's unforeseen. Because if we have a 3 out of 4 multisig, like that's our default setup, and now I give certain signing action rights to someone else that basically overrides or overrules what we have. So this account is then actually more powerful in the whole setup because it can independently, maybe it's also a group, who knows, but basically it will be very hard to really understand who is able to do what for just one account. If you have the ability to just give these signing rights away, because it can it can totally break this kind of behavior where you say, well, we restrict this account through a multisig, but then once you have delegated some stuff away, basically that overpowers some of the stuff that you already have. I mean, it definitely needs very good user interface to manage that complexity. But is that what you have in mind, that you just can overpower this kind of stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, put it this way, like I look at it through the current behavior and constraints we have on multisig today. And I'm not bringing this up as like, this is the way it should be done. I'm just bringing it up as like, there's 2 alternatives, right? So like, in some ways, if you look at like cross-account delegation, then potentially that's maybe a different way to implement multisig in general, right? Would you not agree?
Yeah.
Right, like being able to delegate to someone to say, hey, you can transfer my tokens for me. It's kind of like, that's like whether my account's a multisig or not, if I delegate to Paul's account, whether or not Paul's a single signer or 6 signers, like I don't care. Whether or not he's actually on my multisig or not, I don't care. So at the end of the day, we're, like functionally, it's kind of all the same thing. The question is, does everyone have to exist within the same account to put these constraints at like a logical level? Or can they just be any accounts on the chain? And then this can be yet a different implementation of kind of multisig and approval, right? It's I guess to your point, Paul, you're almost doing like a one-off multisig definition per action in a way.
Yeah, and that's where I see a lot of potential and a lot of potential issues. But maybe because I think this is a concept that, well, anybody who will listen to us talking about it will probably have no clue unless we draw it. Maybe one of the notes that we can make is that we should try to draw this, because basically the concept of someone signing for someone else is counterintuitive, even though that's how multisig works, right? So maybe just some simple diagrams that explain what is possible right now and how this could be possible based on the same functionality would be really helpful to basically see if this is something that devs really want to do or not. Is that a good idea or not?
Yeah. So
it sounds like when you
had already kind of added like a action item. We have 2 big takeaways. Like one of them is, let's kind of dig more into like programmable mosaics or whatever it might be or become at some point. The other one is this account filter delegation of actions. which we had obviously talked about a while ago, but we haven't dug into it at this level. So I'd say these are kind of like the two biggest takeaways.
Yep. So
yeah, and I think with this one, as long as you can delegate at a granular level by transaction type or action type, it doesn't really matter which of the two we do unduly in my head.
Yeah, I mean, it'll definitely at the end of the day, like the way to think of it is you're invoking is like the state of the ledger via a transaction, which is kind of the action that's doing it. And so all of this is kind of like this access control, right? So again, the origins of this were kind of, hey, there is this scenario due to limitations of how many multi-sig accounts like you can belong to that someone could spam you and link you up. So let's have the ability to be able to kind of like allow or block someone who can invoke that action, you know, of adding me. So yeah, that's definitely the mindset of a transaction is an action, and you have keys that are accounts, whether it's a single account or a multi-sig account, and we're trying to allow or constrain what can be done. Yeah.
There's actually one more thing that I would like to raise as a topic for today, and I think, well, basically the allocated time is over, right? But most of the token trading, well, we've all seen this, right? Based on the VTF doc, but there are some things that need a little more. You need more ability, basically. For example, I think also in the US you have you have laws that can force transfers, and obviously in Multisig that's also something that is more or less easily solved, right? Because in Multisig you can also set it up in a way that there's always a majority that can just transfer. But there was also the suggestion of having claimable transactions, that if something, a claimable attribute to a Mosaic, that if it's claimable, it can be proactively also co-signed by the issuer, so that the issuer always has co-signing rights for that specific supply of Mosaic for any account holding that. And that is something that could also be interesting for some other applications. So that's one of the things that we could discuss. Maybe not today. It doesn't have to be today. And there are some financial instruments, and thinking about financial instruments is definitely interesting, because that is really the combination of stuff that we are talking about. Like this is what we're trying to enable at the end of the day, right? So it's not just how to interact with this stuff, but what we're actually trying to enable and what's also in demand, more or less. But I don't know if we should end it today and maybe take next week to discuss this. And also obviously there's some other stuff. And actually some stuff in the appendix that's quite interesting to look at, because the ecosystem is actually moving really rapidly, and like there are new reports more or less every week, and new companies popping up and doing some interesting stuff. But we should only take inspiration from that, because it's easy to get lost in all the new stuff. So Nate, since you're
time-wise, Paul, I can carry on for another half hour, 45 minutes, depending on how you guys are.
Well, it's 2 a.m. here, so I'm honestly a little tired. But,
where are you?
Uzbekistan. So now
okay.
that's recorded forever in this live stream. It's already late.
That's a highly relevant topic. Again, like through my old lens of like the private equity stuff, is the variant of that is needed. Whereas again, in a lot of these asset classes and regulated scenarios, you do need this notion of like full autonomy, where I have control over my assets and no one can do stuff with it, is not really for a lot of asset classes and jurisdictions and stuff. So let's kind of, actually, I'm just going to add this. We can make this a, say,
I think it's really like, especially with the stuff, claiming and so on. I think we will come to the same conclusion as for other Multisig stuff, but maybe we should actually take some time for because, well, obviously, if it's a regulated asset, there will always be people who have some sort of control over it, and that also means that most likely, not a single individual having full control over it. But anyways, so Nate, wait, let me actually, I can also look at the notes.
So I just kind of added, so scroll down, added that last, for next.
Next, that's called.
That's
okay, you're doing it. Okay.
Yeah.
Chronologically. So yes, asset control, clawback claim. Yes. Julian, with regards to content, do you want to add something actually?
I just wanted to mention one thing exactly. And I think it's on, if you can scroll back to page 13 in the report, that's actually mostly from Ethereum. They already have defined a set of functionalities that should be included in the token standard. Page 13.
30?
13. 10.
Sorry.
My bad.
Yes, actually I know the big table.
No, it's just a few bullet points actually.
It's not the standard, because we also have the big comparison table, right?
Yeah, that's basically this is the short form of it, which is just showing 3-4 bullet points. What is important to definitely include in their point of view, and yeah, we've talked already about metadata. I think they definitely have rule checking already. Then
the permission. Well, this is definitely something. That we already. We will discuss a lot more, I think, the flexibility permissions.
They also have partition token, where you have one token that can be used for multiple parts, basically, you can associate different permissions for them, right? By issuing only one token, but it's associating more metadata, different metadata to them.
But I think that's part of the this beautiful table that goes into this kind of stuff. I mean, it's actually quite insane.
That's the full body of it. But really interesting is basically the security token standard, which is coming out of this, just ERC 1400, 1410, and they are kind of trying to define right now the standards. They have a good GitHub page where you can also see what they want to have included, and I think they're really advanced already.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea to take note of those, and maybe we can do a comparative analysis next time. Do you know when this is coming out, or is this already? Because I know that Consensus already presented it some time ago, right? But they're still making changes, right?
Yeah, they're always developing it. It's never going to be finished, basically.
Breaking changes every single week.
But Consensus has published this Doriel network kind of implementation of it. I think it's a white label solution, but I don't know if it's enterprise grade level. Definitely not.
Yeah, they're working towards. I mean, they're highly involved, and they even on the legal implementation side. So I think they've acquired at least one broker dealer and legal team in the U.S. At least one of them, and then they have their own house as well. So they're definitely pushing on this both as a solution and just for internal usage.
For example, I just remembered. When a token is transferred, they always have an error message. It has to be specific, they say. Paul, you mentioned it. It is for NEM, it would be whitelisting is accepted or not. You don't have.
We have these kind of error messages for just in general for any errors that could pop up. For example, insufficient funds, COSIC, whatever, not enough signatures or timeouts of certain things. But is there reasoning behind the error messages that they specifically define for securities that they believe these are legally necessary, or what's the point?
It's probably to standardize. So as you talk solutions and UX and stuff, so like you kind of standardize the interface of the inputs and the calls and outputs and errors and whatever and status messages.
Yeah.
Like two different apps that were done by two different orgs that have different solutions, but on the same standard can like display a message.
Yeah, you could easily imagine like a third-party wallet that can hold multiple assets. If they all display the same kind of error message, it gets really easy to make that wallet consistent
But I mean,
across the assets.
For them, it will probably be just generic, like not targeted at, we are not going to say, well, this is the security token error message, right? Because the features, we always hope to propose features that can be used for multiple use cases. So with regards to that, we will probably not have messages that are as specific.
Yeah, I suppose if we had like an asset type and it was security or not, it'd be fairly easy to just append that to, or prepend that to the message to get some kind of a specific one if you wanted it.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, could be. Okay,
then there was,
is there anything else? Yes.
Then there was actually this one metadata group. They already tried to define what is a set of standards for metadata. This could also be interesting to just put in the link actually in the doc. I am looking for the link and I will just share it. Maybe we can talk next time about this more.
Is that for just specifically targeted at security tokens for metadata, or?
Yeah, it's only about security tokens. I think they actually had a huge list, and I feel like they want to basically put everything in from issuer name to whatever, but they might also include really irrelevant ones.
Okay. Yeah, that could actually be also interesting, but at the same time, I think the solution that is proposed for metadata is, well, basically completely open, right? It's a key value store. We're not restricting stuff. I mean, what is actually an interesting point is more the fungibility and metadata that's tied to a specific quantity of mosaics, right? So if I, for example, want to have the transfer recorded and actually link that, I mean, it's obviously linked in the transaction metadata, but I mean, I cannot distinguish, like if I have 50 tokens and I receive them in tranches of 10 tokens, I cannot distinguish which 10 tokens hold which kind of metadata. We don't really have non-fungible tokens. Because I saw multiple times that fungibility and non-fungible tokens is something that is explicitly targeted in some of these standards. Like here, partially fungible tokens.
It's something that at a gut feel, I think, if you want to be really successful in the security section, at some point, we'll probably have to support a level of non-fungibility. Because there's going to be use cases where you just simply have to record the ID that it relates to off-chain because it relates to something specific.
Yeah. I mean, there are obviously workarounds based on the transaction metadata because you can always carry it through and you have the full history. But it's not like this token has ID 1, this token has ID 2, and so on.
Yeah, like if you imagine a typical share register where you, or I don't know, even a lottery where you own lottery ticket number 345. Like there's just a bunch of stuff with non-fungibility in general, outside of securities and inside of securities, that it seems very useful. In the security space, I think there will be some use cases that we'll find that you just can't find a workaround for without it.
Aleix built the non-fungible token library, I think. Maybe I actually need to take a look at that, what it supports and what it doesn't support. Nate, do you have any opinion on the fungibility topic? Like, is it something we should note down?
Yes, but it's really hard to be like approachable, right? So like the deepest we had kind of discussed in the past year was the notion that in like kind of the early origins of like metadata conversation last year is on the send, you could apply a single restricted metadata tag that would like go with it. Kind of like right now we have like the message at like the transaction level, but this thing would kind of live with, and we just got as far as talking about the concept, and that the constraints that would have to be imposed in order to have it scale would be, you know, pretty significant. And that's about as far as we kind of talked about it. So like the use cases we had from last year was concert tickets, where you have 10,000 concert tickets in a Mosaic, you know, quantity 10,000, and then when you send one of them, you tag it with a very particular like metadata tag, which would be like the ticket ID. And then if that gets transferred, that would live with it. So if someone resells it or whatever, that ticket ID would be there and could be verified, or, you know, some barcode ID or something. And it lives with that. It's like locked to that individual one as like a little bundled piece of data that goes with it for all time. And again, we didn't get that deep with it. It was just brought up as a concept when we originally started talking about metadata. So I think we can talk about it. The idea was always, well, the level of constraints from a performance and storage perspective. Like for instance, the very first thing is, well, you'd have to have very specific constraints on the piece of data and the size. And then the second constraint is you'd probably also have a constraint that if you were to implement this, you'd have to have an upper limit on the number of assets. So you could,
sure,
like a billion quantity of a Mosaic and then send out all billion and tag those billion. You could be like, well, if you're going to implement this like IDing kind of fungible mechanism, the system's going to impose some other restriction of like, hey, you can only do X thousand or whatever, million or something, right? Again,
but it changes a lot of stuff, because then the transfer would actually be selective. Like right now, it's always the full amount, and then you would actually, or you could potentially select a subset of the amount that you have, and it would change a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Again, like it was just dug in at the level of conceptually conversation is like, well, first of all, how would this affect performance and storage if you have, like the first thing is like, well, okay, let's say you're just adding a little bundle of data. Okay, that's one thing. Okay, now let's say you have like 10 million of these. Okay, the first thing you're gonna have to constrain the data so that you can't like just lop on like a whole bunch of data to this thing. So now let's assume that's constrained. The next thing is, what happens if you don't have 10 million or 100 million, you have a billion? Okay, you obviously would have to have some level of constraints at that level as well. And we never, you know, the devs probably were like, that's crazy about that right now. I mean, that level of conversation was just the constraints. There has to be some severe constraints on it beyond what would actually have to happen from like this asset transferring around the world to different users and having that piece of data live with it. And you can't like reapply like a new one, right? It's kind of having like a immutable tag that once applied cannot be changed, right? So anyways, that's again, to answer your question, talked about it at that super high level 10 months ago or however long, probably, yeah, almost a year ago.
Yeah.
So I think we can kind of like talk about it again through the lens of metadata functionality, but that would be like at the back of the list as far as like having basic metadata.
Okay, so well, the metadata conditions, not conditions, sorry, the metadata stuff that they defined in some of the standards. Julian, if you can find the link, maybe just paste it in the call notes.
I will. I'm already looking, but it's hidden somewhere.
It's lost in the 70 pages.
Yeah,
so
it's a really good document, guys. I obviously didn't have time to absorb all of it, but I had to skim through most of it, and it's really well done.
Thanks a lot. Well, I hope that actually some people will also read it. Usually, with
at some point, I'll manage to get several hours to absorb all of it. But it's yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information in there, right? And it's important stuff to understand.
The problem is that it's only growing. I think basically this can only grow because well, the issue is that there's new information coming out rapidly, right? So we somehow really have to. I think what would be a good approach is that, because we also, we mentioned before, we have to be, well, I want to say super careful, but people need to sign off that we can share this publicly. So one idea is that obviously we take the sections that are just interesting for the working group discussions and put them in different docs and or even put them on GitHub so that we can have this discussion like openly and so on, and we don't have to worry about like who said what and if this is some information that was not supposed to go out. But for that, actually, I mean, it would be helpful if maybe some people from the Slack group look over it and give some feedback. But well, I'm not super hopeful that lots of people will comment a lot, but hope that lasts. So maybe in the next meeting we can just finish the topics that we want to discuss, also based on this document, and then we can. Or Nate, maybe you can then start transferring some stuff, or we can jointly transfer some stuff to GitHub.
Yeah, that sounds good. And then again, hopefully we'll have, this is probably our longest meeting across any group for all time so far, but we have this recording as well as far as documentation, and if someone needs to like skim through it because people couldn't attend today or whatever. But again, we definitely went super deep in some areas and gone over, but yeah, I mean, this is definitely content-wise good, definitely a good session. And so I guess probably we should definitely plan to continue the conversation next week. So over the next few days, we can, kind of just coordinate times and, have conversation on Slack and see who else might or might not join, and then go from there. And definitely spend more time consuming the doc. And,
do we know, just maybe as an interesting question also for the Slack people, do we know if there are some interesting developments in Asia with regards to security tokens? I mean, I know that Japan is super restrictive right now and everybody's on the sideline just looking and waiting. But I assume Hong Kong, Singapore, and so on, there's some development. So do we have any people that are active in these regions that may have some additional input that we may miss, based on the European American perspective?
Maybe. I mean, I asked the guys in Japan, and they're kind of like, yeah. I was like, do you have any specific input based on some prospects and regulations that are popping? And they're kind of like, yeah, not really. They're like, you're going to support stuff that would support like the U.S. from like an asset-based perspective. You're probably going to, that's pretty much the answer. Like, hey, if you can support the U.S., then you're going to be able to support Japan with just specific other constraints, but it's kind of mirroring it. But there might be some stuff. So like, for instance, I know general consensus is like Singapore is just kind of drafting off the U.S. in a way. They're trying to be a little bit more permissive, but really just for general, securities and asset classes, they're going to do kind of what the U.S. does. But they're trying to be a little bit more welcoming on the business side for startups to like create their base there. I
do seem to remember Thailand is doing something. I can't remember what it was. Laura put something up about it the other day.
Yeah, and then
I think it would be interesting just for the discussions if some people have some additional input in these regions.
Yeah, Laura's definitely speaking to the national stock market of Thailand, and it was something that she put up from them. So there's obviously something starting to move there if the national stock market's getting involved.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so we can post and just kind of add that as actually let's add that as another note.
There's another weird law coming through in Malta, actually, if you guys didn't notice, which now that I think about it, does have some potential implications for the STOs. They're giving the ability for a DAO to be a legal person or legal entity, to be the first people globally to put that ledge through. So you'll have the same institutional rights as an individual or a company. But I don't know quite how you register them. But obviously, if one of those entities were to then issue a security, yeah, but I don't know. Yeah,
who's signing the documents?
Totally, right? Like that's why they're the first people to have a crack at that one, because as soon as you start thinking about it, your brain starts hurting.
It's an interesting concept, actually. Yeah, for property transfer and that kind of stuff, it could be really interesting.
But from our perspective, obviously, if you go and register DAO in Malta and then issue security from there, like
you're good to go, right? No one goes to prison.
Yeah, you could have a whole bunch of weird use cases. The core, that's coming.
I mean, there's probably some. I mean, there's some laws. I forgot what it was about, but basically, if they can get a hold of the person, like the whatever is executing, basically the developer is then responsible at the end of the day, something like that. Like it basically just goes up to until you find someone who's a real human being, and you make that person responsible. Like I don't know if it was about the Malta thing, but usually there's always a catch-20 where you still find someone who can go to prison.
The committers on the GitHub repo.
Yeah, basically. Okay. So Nate, you want to call it a day?
Yeah. So thanks everyone for hopping on. Definitely awesome session, and continue the conversation on Slack, and we can target next week. We can target the same day or another day. I know, Paul, you're still out there for another couple of weeks.
Just next week, actually. So,
okay.
But it's more or less okay. I'm kind of living in the EU time zone based on demand, so
okay.
It's fine. So yeah, next week, same time, I think is a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, let's plan for that for now, and then again, we'll post some messages, and if a couple people hop on and they're like, I'd love to join, but I can't, like for instance, maybe some of the APAC people, so we can maybe proactively post a message and say, hey, we'd like more APAC people to join, and then in which case we might shift it based on that, right? Since it is, the earlier we do it here, the harder it is for them in the morning. So anyways, we can figure that out in the next few days and early next week.
Sure. All right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thanks everybody, and talk soon. Bye-bye.
So, cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.